Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination, but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 421. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about deserts, dramatic coastlines, camel merchants, and the Moroccan Wall as we go to the Western Sahara.
I got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. We're going to skip the news for this particular episode, but I do have some personal news, which is that I'm recording this overlooking Petra. I'm in the country of Jordan as a guest of the tourism board, and you'll hear more about that later on for sure. But that means I'm a little cut off from the internet, so we're going to jump right into the interview today. I'd like to welcome back to the show Francis Tapon, who's come to talk to us about Western Sahara. Francis, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Chris. Nice to be back.
And you may recall, those of you who've been listeners for a while, that Francis came and talked about a book that he had done on Eastern Europe. Hidden Europe, is that the correct name? Do I have that correct?
That's right, The Hidden Europe.
The Hidden Europe, and you are now working on sort of a sequel, but it's all about Africa.
That's right. It's called The Unseen Africa.
And your current plan is to spend 4 years in Africa visiting every country, and you're a little more than 1 year in?
That's exactly right. So I've basically, in my first year, I focused exclusively on West Africa. So now I'm entering year two, where I'll focus mostly on Central Africa and a bit maybe into Southern Africa. And then year three, I should be in Eastern Africa, including the islands of Madagascar, Seychelles, and Comoros, and that kind of stuff. And then eventually, the final year, year four, 2017, I should be in North Africa.
So don't be too surprised if Francis makes his way back onto the show talking about some other part of Africa here over the next few years.
That's great.
Before we talk about Western Sahara, which may or may not be a country in Africa, you are coming to us from where right now?
I'm coming from Niger, actually the capital of Niger, which is Niamey. And it's just north of Nigeria. It's basically in the Sahara. It's a very hot country. In fact, it's about 45 degrees Celsius here, which is about 108 Fahrenheit. And that's in the shade.
And just before we started recording this, we were just about to press the record button and start, and you ran out of power. So this is just Africa. Ran out of power, as in the city, the power turned off.
Yeah, it happens a few times a day. And in fact, Niamey, the capital of Niger, is actually better than most places. When I was in Benin, it happened almost every day for hours and hours of the day. And in fact, in Guinea-Bissau was one of the worst places where even in the capital, we would only have a couple of hours of power for the whole week. And so only the richest people, they could afford generators, but most of the people lived their entire life, even in the capital, without electricity in Guinea-Bissau.
So Western Sahara, and I say it may or may not be a country. I'm not just being facetious there. Tell us a little bit about the Western Sahara.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's one of these disputed territories, kind of like Somaliland is a territory that wants to be independent from Somalia. Well, it's the same issue here. The Western Sahara is a region that if you're a Moroccan and a few other people, you would believe that it is part of Morocco. If you're somebody else, you might want it to be an independent country. And so that battle has been raging on ever since the Spanish, who actually colonized it, left in 1975. So when the Spanish left, Morocco said, great, we'll take that territory that you left behind and fill that vacuum. And then the locals, or at least not all, some of the locals said, whoa, 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 we don't want you, Morocco. We actually want to be independent. So we want to be our own independent country. Ever since 1975, this battle has been fought, both a political battle and both a military battle between these two forces.
And since we're talking about a place with the term battle, let's start with the most obvious question is, before we talk about how wonderful it is to go to the Western Sahara, is it safe to go to the Western Sahara?
It totally is. Yeah, I was just there earlier in 2013, and it was quite calm. And I went all over the place. And there are some military checkpoints that they will not let you go past, partially for your own safety, partly is just to control things. But you can certainly drive all over the place and nothing's going to happen to you. You're not going to get kidnapped, that kind of stuff, and have any kind of war going on. Right now, there's been a ceasefire, in fact, for almost 25 years. Ever since 1991, there's been a ceasefire. There are occasional protests here and there that crop up, but they're usually in a city center. If you're not running around the middle of the city center holding up a big banner, you're probably not going to be clobbered. So just use common sense if you happen to be in one of these protests. But the protests are becoming fewer and fewer with each passing year.
Okay. And why should someone go to Western Sahara?
Well, a lot of people love to go to Morocco for good reasons. Morocco, as you've done in some of your previous podcasts, is a wonderful, amazing country. The Western Sahara, which, again, I'm going to argue in this, just to make it simple, I'm just going to say it's part of Morocco, partially, and I'll explain later why I believe that, why it should be considered part of Morocco in the future. But the bottom line is the Western Sahara is kind of like, why would you go to America and just see New York and Washington, D.C.? Wouldn't you want to see like the Grand Canyon? Wouldn't you want to see some other parts that are less visited and natural wonders? And I think the Sahara is certainly one of those. And even though Morocco proper has parts that are in the Sahara, the Western Sahara is just far less populated. It's a population of 500,000 people in a territory that's the size of Colorado.
So you had mentioned you thought that the Western Sahara is or will be part of Morocco or should be considered that way. And you have some reasons behind that.
Yeah, this is a really sore subject, and it's a very touchy subject, especially people who feel that the Western Sahara should be independent. And there's definitely a lot of people who feel that way. This is a complex issue, so I'm going to try to summarize it simply. I hope to elaborate much more in my future book, which will come out in 2018 or 2019. But the bottom line is the way territories work in the world is people come and go. No territory in the world has the same people that it always had in history. So, for example, the Crimea, which has been in the news lately, had Tatars who were there. And there were people before the Tatars. And eventually Russians came and kind of kicked the Tatars out. Unfairly, unjustly, brutally, but eventually it became Russian. And nowadays, Tatars are a very minority there. And to argue that it should be Tatar again and should be its own independent Tatar country is kind of strange. Same thing, United States. We have like Mississippi, which is used to be Native American territory. Well, then we kicked the Native Americans out. We pushed them off into reservations. But now, if Native Americans ran around and said, hey, this is Native American land, we should be independent from the United States, the people in Mississippi and most of America will say, sorry, it's kind of a little bit late on this issue. And sorry, you just have to accept that nowadays, whether we did it justly or unjustly, it should be part of America. And so, and there's countries in all through the spectrum of these transitions. And in this Western Sahara, basically what you have is that you had perhaps in 1975, if you had held a referendum, an honest, real referendum, you would have gotten the majority of the population saying we want to be independent and not part of Morocco. I bet you that would have been the case. Morocco resisted having a referendum. They said, we will do a referendum. And they still say some, but nowadays they change their mind. We're not going to do a referendum anymore. And the problem is that a lot of the people who were Western Saharans, who were Sahrawis, they were pushed off into Tindouf, which is a reservation camp in Algeria. And so there's a whole issue of who gets to vote. Just like if we pushed out all the Native Americans out of Mississippi and then say, okay, we're going to have a referendum whether Mississippi should be part of the United States or independent. And then, oh my God, everybody votes to stay part of the United States. And then, of course, the Native Americans who are sitting in their reservation in Oklahoma say, well, that's because you didn't let us vote, because you pushed us all the way out here and we didn't get to vote. It's the same problem. The people who were Sahrawis, who were living in that area, got pushed out into Algeria. But here's the thing. During this whole time, just like Americans colonized and basically pushed themselves and reproduced and took over all this Native American land, Moroccans have done the same thing in the last 30 years, 40 years, where they've basically encouraged a lot of Moroccans to migrate and move into Western Sahara. Mm-hmm. So when I went into the streets of the Western Sahara and talked with people, just random people all over on the street, for the most part, people were saying, we are Moroccans. We think the Western Sahara should be Moroccans. And it was really hard. I found a few people, but it was hard to find people who said, we want independence. And so what has happened, for good or bad, Morocco has basically colonized and encouraged Moroccans to take over. And of course, there were Moroccans there who were always wanted to be behind Morocco in the first place. But here's another thing, and I got to give Moroccan government a lot of credit on this issue. Morocco has plowed in a ton of money and resources into the area. A lot of the people who want independence say, no, that's not true. They just take the phosphate mines and they just are just taking all the fish out of the sea and they're just mining us for all their good. There's a lot more money it's going into the Western Sahara than coming out of the Western Sahara. And a lot of people don't recognize that. And it's just like a lot more money is going into Mississippi than is coming out of Mississippi. Mississippi is a big drain on America. It's a poor state. And we funnel a lot of money into Mississippi. Same thing, Morocco, just like Kosovo, if you look at Serbia, during the Yugoslav era, they've plowed a bunch of money into Kosovo. So it's a poor state that Morocco has kind of helped to prop up. There's a lot of new schools getting made. Like I said, there's paved roads everywhere. So Moroccans have done their best to make the territory viable and economically better off than they were 30, 40 years ago. So that's a long answer to what really deserves even a longer answer.
And we were talking about size before we started doing the recording. And a lot of people don't realize, and I think until recently I was one of them, how big Africa is, because our maps, the Mercator projection, kind of make it look smaller because it's there by the equator. You were saying the Sahara itself is how big?
Oh, the whole Sahara is the size of the contiguous United States. So if you can imagine being in New York and driving all the way to LA, and all you see is sand and desert and rock, and it's just all Sahara. That's the size of the Western Sahara. From Miami all the way up to Washington State is the size of the Sahara. So wow. It's just massive, and it's mind-bogglingly big. And the Western Sahara is just a little tiny piece of the entire Sahara. But it is really a place to have some wide open space. We Americans kind of pride ourselves on having wide open space as well. Sahara kind of wins by a long shot.
And what kind of itinerary do you recommend for the Western Sahara?
Well, I would suggest that most people are going to start in Morocco.
Hmm.
And so from there, you're going to descend down into the Western Sahara. And most people will just go straight to Laayoune, which is the capital or the biggest city, has about 250,000 people. The city itself is okay. It's mainly an administrative capital, administrative area, and it has businesses and that kind of stuff. But for me, the best things to see are deep into the Sahara itself, the Western Sahara, as well as Dakhla, which is much further south. It's the last major city that you'll see. In fact, the only other really big town there. And they're trying to make it into a tourist destination. I think that they might succeed in doing that. So I would say those three things would be Dakhla, just driving along the coastline, and then making an incursion into the actual desert area. So in other words, away from the coast. So you got to see a bit of the inland area. You got to see the coast, and you got to see Dakhla. Those are the three things I would say should be on anybody's agenda if they go to the Western Sahara.
And for someone who has a little less than 4 years to visit Africa, say a week or two, how would you tackle it? Is this something where you ought to get part of a tour? You ought to just rent a car and head off into the desert, hopefully with a lot of water in the trunk? Or
Well, yeah, it's definitely, if you only have about a week in the Western Sahara, then you're probably going to have to give up your dream of going inland unless you can somehow find a local driver and rent out a car once you're in, let's say, Dakhla or Laayoune. Those two major towns you could either hire a driver who has a car and go to places like Smara. Smara is a town that's kind of inland, which I visited as well. Soon after, they actually had a small protest there. But there was a little bit of tension in the town, but pretty hard to notice unless you talk to a lot of locals there. If you only have a week, then most people are just going to have enough time to go down to Dakhla along the coastline and then drive all the way back up, unless they can somehow fly out. But it would be a pity to not be able to do some sort of incursion into the Western Sahara.
Well, let's talk about the 1 week, and then let's add in more time and talk about what we would do. So if I'm driving on the coast, what am I going to see? What is it going to look like?
Well, it's pretty spectacular. One of the things that the main economy of the Western Sahara is fishing. And so they have an amazing coastline that is empty for the most part. And you're going to see everything from like these rugged, jagged peaks that just drop straight into the ocean, these classic, as well as seeing beaches. If you go all the way down to Dakhla, you're going to get to a area where there's kind of a bay, and it's protected, and then you'll be able to see more touristic stuff. Like you'll be able to see windsurfers, you'll be able to see kite surfers, you'll be able to get on a jet ski if you feel like doing that, and see a bit of that in Dakhla itself. Aside from that, it's pretty much empty land, and you can just camp and hang out anywhere you want on this huge coastline where there's hardly anybody there.
And you are camping your way through Africa?
I'm camping quite a bit. I definitely camped quite a bit in the Western Sahara. It's wonderful because you just you don't have to worry about ever raining on you. There's no precipitation, basically. Temperatures are warm, although in certain times of the years it can get chilly and you'll want to have a nice sleeping bag. But bottom line is, yeah, you can certainly camp anywhere along the way, except, of course, in the major towns where they do have hotels and other accommodations to stay in.
Are there particular sites we should try and see? I'm getting sort of a trackless land picture in my head, so I don't know if if you're there, you really need to see this particular spot or not.
Yeah, I think that's the joy, is in fact not to have any set agenda on where to go in the interior part. When you're talking about the exterior part, Dakhla is, I would say, the highlight of the Western Sahara. It is the prime tourist destination to go to. And so that is right on the coast near the southern half of the Western Sahara. And so that would be probably your best bet, unless you want to go all the way down close to Mauritania and go into there. But bottom line is that, I would say, is the one spot on the map that you have to go to.
And it sounds like you're recommending it more for the activities than the sites.
No, I would say also the scenery is just beautiful. It has fantastic deserted beaches, and you have good food and great fish cuisine that you can have. And there's also good tourist infrastructure. There's good hotels, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
You have it all there in Dakhla. So
Very similar to the rest of Morocco or to Morocco, depending on how we're counting it at this point, in terms of the food and the accommodations and those sort of things.
well, definitely not as developed as Morocco.
Okay.
And so they have it. And I would say the food is very fish based. And so, of course, Morocco has a fair amount of fish as well. But Morocco, you can get a variety of cuisine that you may not find in, let's say, Dakhla.
And we're still in a northern African culture here rather than a sub-Saharan African culture, obviously.
Yes, that's right. And so the dominant culture here is the Arabic culture, and the people there, they'll speak either some flavor of Arabic, so either Moroccan Arabic or Hassaniya Arabic. It was a Spanish colony, as I mentioned before, but still, I'm fluent in Spanish, and I found it rare to find anybody who could speak Spanish. I think French is a little bit more easy to find, just because Morocco is now really installing itself, and the official language in Morocco is French. So the official international language, I say. Besides Arabic. So you will not see a lot of black Africans in the Western Sahara, that's for sure.
And how is your Arabic coming along?
It's terrible, shwiya, as they would say. So as I mentioned before, I'm going to be heading back into North Africa toward the end of this trip. So in the meantime, I've been taking lessons and trying to learn some Arabic. It's a slow going because I'm not I'm about to go to Chad next, and so I'll have a chance to practice my Arabic in Chad. But it's definitely a challenge, but I'm 100% determined to become at least proficient, if not fluent in Arabic by the year 2017.
And getting along in Western Sahara without being able to speak the language any harder or easier than other places?
I would say it's a little bit easier if you just speak English, for example. It's a bit easier than other places, mainly because the people in the Western Sahara are very friendly and very outgoing. And so when you run into people like that, they're just going to bend over to try to understand what you're trying to say. And so that is half the battle, if you will. If somebody wants to try to understand you, that's half the battle. And there you're going to be understood somehow. And when you run into a very grumpy culture or somebody who's very closed-minded, they won't have patience, and they'll just write you off if you say 3 words in French the wrong way.
So if we throw in another week or two and we get some time to go into the interior, where would we go, or how would we do that?
Well, I would definitely want to check out the Western Sahara Wall. And not because it's like the Great Wall of China, which actually gives it a fair run for the money. It's almost a third of the length of the Great Wall of China. The entire eastern side of the Western Sahara has this long wall. But it's not the wall that you might think of, like a big, like German, the Berlin Wall or the Chinese Wall. It's a wall made of sand and dirt and rock. And so it's kind of just piled up. So you can almost walk over it, especially because it's so eroded now. But it is a sight to see just how it just stretches on forever. And there's a lot of military posts that have been abandoned there. And I thought it would be very hard to go there, but in fact, it's easy.
This is a man-made wall, not a naturally occurring wall.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
So when the war started they became independent in 1975, the Moroccans and those who wanted independence, Morocco basically created that wall in order to say, this is ours on the west side of this wall, and you guys can have the rest on the east side of the wall. They conveniently made the wall so that basically took about 80% of the Western Sahara is on the west side of that wall. So 20% is on the east side of the wall and effectively forms the border between Mauritania and Algeria. By the way, the main guy who's really against this is Algeria. They are the ones who are the most furious about this. And of course, the locals, Sahrawi. The Sahrawi are the people of the Western Sahara. And there's several there who are angry about this whole situation. But yeah, it's definitely a wall that you can see. And I would encourage you, and it's hard to miss it. You just keep driving east and you'll eventually bump into it.
So we get a driver, we get a car, we head off into the Sahara. We're going to hit the wall eventually. Are we heading off towards a particular town or oasis or mountain or valley, or just a lot of sand dunes?
Well, I would say for my case, I came in from the north. I came from the town of Zag, which is in Morocco, and I descended down into Smara. And it was funny because I was with my own car and I was driving along, and then all of a sudden, as I'm driving along, and this was like basically right near Western Sahara, this Jeep, military Jeep, just pulled up alongside me, driving really fast, and he was just like pulling around side, and they had rifles, and they weren't pointing the rifles at me, but I was like, "Oh, hello," kind of surprised. And they told me that I was heading off in the wrong direction. I was going into a military red zone, so they stopped me and they forced me to turn around. But you're not going to run into that problem unless you go way too east. I'm trying to see the unseen parts of Africa, so I'm kind of trying to push the limits.
Hmm.
But I think that if you go to places like Smara, Smara, you can also, I went to also to Bukra, which is Boucraa. Bukra is a big phosphate mining town. That's one of the big, besides fishing, phosphate mining is the big industry in the Western Sahara. And so that's you can go there. But south of Bukra, they won't let you go further south of that. So they'll kind of stop you there. So what I did is I went across to Bojdour, which almost looks like bonjour in French, but it's actually called Bojdour. And from there, I went a bit south and then cut into a place called Bir Anzane, Bir. Bir in Arabic means well. So, like, as in to get water, a water well.
Oh, okay.
So, Bir Anzane, which is like a well, the Anzane well, if you will. And so I just drove there because it was a point on the map. And so I just was driving along and I picked up a random hitchhiker there. And he was actually a black guy. And so, which was kind of surprising. I wasn't expecting to have it. He was of a darker skin color than a typical Arabic person.
Mm-hmm.
And then he told me, "Well, just come with me, and we'll go to Biaranzani together, and I'll show you the person I work for." And he actually had 600 camels, the guy he works for, that they're overseeing out there. And so I got to camp with them and stay with them for a few days, and got to see how it is like for a person to manage 600 camels. So that was a pretty remarkable thing, and I got to hang out with them, and you're really in the middle of nowhere. And the other thing that was advantageous to go with somebody who's local, like I was lucky to pick up this hitchhiker, is that there are still a few mines that have not been cleared, and so they know the areas that have been mined still, and so they helped me avoid those areas.
Now, I would assume that would be off the road.
Correct. Yeah, and that's right. And so the road is pretty clear, and that's the other thing. It's you can really see how Morocco has invested a fair amount of money into the Western Sahara. The roads are paved, a lot of paved roads, and they're fresh, new paved roads. They're not like the crappy paved roads that you'll see in a lot of West Africa, which are full of potholes and just disasters. These are just as good as any paved road you'll find in the United States. And you'll find them all over in the Western Sahara. Of course, if you go deep enough, those roads will turn into dirt roads and turn into kind of sandy roads. But still, it's easy to avoid the mined areas because as long as you stay on a designated road.
Now, we've named a number of different towns there, and I don't have a mental image of them. So you mentioned a phosphate mining town, so I'm picturing something gritty and industrial.
It's not at all industrial at all. In fact, it's quite pristine. I stayed there with a guy who was working in the mines. There's no smokestacks. I mean, they're just digging holes and pulling out phosphates out of them. So it's not this kind of ugly, dirty town at all. It's just a desert town. And there you just have a chance to see some of the industry in action, if you will. But it's not unattractive.
Okay. And then you pictured the well out here in a desert town. I'm picturing date palms and some source of water, the well. What else is in town? There's a mosque. There's a market.
Yeah, they have some simple things. If you go out to these really villagey areas, then yes, you will find exactly as you described. You'll find the palm trees. You'll find the tiny mosque. You'll get into a village. I mean, it's mainly an area to chill out. You're not going to find the internet. It's a place where people, if you need a timeout, this is a place to go. You want to go to the Western Sahara if you want a time out from everything, because it's just out there in the middle of nowhere. I mean, even if you stay along the coastline, it's still pretty quiet even along the coastline. It's just, unless you're in Laayoune or unless you're Bojdour or maybe Dakhla, that's about it. Those three towns are it. All the way in this, and then of course if you're right on the border, there's a little tiny town on the border of Mauritania.
Now, I'm going to guess that a 4-year trek through Africa has a surprise or two. What kind of surprises awaited you in Western Sahara?
Well, the one of them is kind of one I mentioned was the fact that I didn't expect to meet this guy who was working for this other man who was staying 600 camels. What was funny about the whole experience, and I guess to paint a more accurate picture and to show, so I got this guy, he's in a turban and you basically only just see his eyes, right? He's just a
Mm.
hitchhiker, and the sun is setting. And by the time we get to Bir Anzane, which is this, like I said, a little village out there, the sun has set. And right before we get there, we see a mine explosion. And he says this is where there was a car that just last week or last month, I can't remember what it was, had just driven over there and blown up. So I was like, wait a second. You're living in this village and people have been driving all around. And there's tracks, car tracks everywhere. And I was driving on one of these many car tracks, and you're saying that just a month ago somebody just drove and like blew himself up on a mine? And he said, yeah, but the driver didn't die, just destroyed part of the car. And I said, great. And the sun has set, so it's totally dark. And I'm driving with this guy who's going to take me to the middle of nowhere, a camp far from the village. So, I mean, the village was remote enough, but going into a camp in the village. And then I get there and it's totally dark. And the guy who comes out, the owner of the 600 camels, has his military outfit on. So, you know, and he's like dressed in his little turban. I'm like, this sounds like a really great kidnapping story about to happen. Where I'm just like going there and they're just going to take me and then kidnap me away. He's got the military outfit. Who knows if he has weapons? I have nothing, and I'm in the middle of nowhere. Nobody knows where I am. But that's one of these moments. It's kind of surprising, and yet you have to just, I feel, trust people.
And I'm going to guess instead of a kidnapping, you found great hospitality.
Exactly. And that's what almost always happens. And you have to sometimes when you travel, just trust people and just throw it. Yes, occasionally you'll get burned and get robbed or whatever, and that kind of stuff, but it's so rare compared to the amount of wonderful things that happen. And to be able to sit there and watch them make bread, which was another surprising thing. In fact, I showed in my trailer for this television show that I'm working on, The Unseen Africa, there's a great scene where they take bread, flour, they basically warmed up dirt. They made a little fire in the dirt, and then they brush the dirt aside, and then they throw the bread in the dirt, these hot coals in the
Huh.
dirt, and then they cover the bread with dirt, with sand. All the sand is covering the flour. They let it sit there for about 15, 20 minutes, and guess what? After 15, 20 minutes, guess what happens? They pull this bread out of the sand, and it's bread. It's like fully, the flour is totally cooked up, and they wipe all the sand off, and they kind of like, the sand is nice and easy to get off the bread, and you break the bread and you eat it. It's nice and warm and toasty, and it's delicious. It's kind of like, wow. And this is how they cook in the Sahara.
Huh.
And this is a wonderful, surprising way of how they make bread in the middle of the Sahara when there's basically very few trees out anywhere to be seen. It was fascinating. That was truly surprising.
Interesting. You have mentioned that it's a pretty country, that you've talked about the coast, for instance, and some of the other things. You're standing in the prettiest spot in Western Sahara. Where are you standing and what are you looking at?
I really enjoyed two things. I mean,
Mhm.
there's one is, and in fact, unfortunately, I can't tell you. It's somewhere between Bojdur and Dakhla. I just found, I mean, but there's lots of areas.
You can't get there, but okay.
But the bottom line, it's hard to miss. There's just areas where they just have these cliffs that drop straight into the sea. I just think it's beautiful, great cinematography where you can just like show these cliffs that just drop into the sea. Again, from that trailer of The Unseen Africa, you'll see at the very end of it, you'll see a clip of that shoreline there. The second thing is just the desert itself. And really, I'm not that picky about where exactly it is, but I just adore the desert. I love it. I love how clean it is. I love how silent it is. I love how there's just nothing there. I love how I can see for miles and kilometers and there's nothing obstructing my view. I love the big sky. It's just, I love it. And those are the two most spectacular views. And the good news is that you just won't find any ugly industrial part in the entire Western Sahara. You can go anywhere, and you'll just never see anything that you could say, this is ugly, this is unattractive. Everything, certainly if you like desert, you'll be happy everywhere. If you like sea, you'll be happy anywhere along the coastline.
Excellent. One of the questions we ask, especially with this kind of destination, is when did you feel closest to home and when did you feel furthest from home?
my home is San Francisco. I was born and raised there.
Hmm.
And so I would have to say that I would need near a coastline in order to feel close to home. So places like Dakla has a little bay. If you go there the right time of year, I was there in May. It was warmer than you have in San Francisco, but kind of this feel of nice, dry, warm climate that you might find in other parts of the Bay Area outside of San Francisco. You get
Hmm.
that nice, warm, dry climate and have these nice sea views. That's definitely closest to home. Furthest from home was when this guy who was from Mauritania, it's possible, I'm not sure, he might have been a slave. By the way, slavery is still quite active in West Africa. You'll have anywhere in Mauritania, for example, up to 20-25% of the population are slaves. And so in the Western Sahara, you'll find slaves. I was not so imprudent to ask whether the guy was a slave or not, but I'm pretty sure he was. He was from Mauritania. But anyway, what he did is he went up to a camel and he milked the camel
Hmm.
and then gave me the milk. And I drank it straight out of the camel and it was still warm.
Hmm.
And that's when I realized I'm far from home.
Huh. And you've surprised me a little bit here with slavery because I did not realize that. Now, this is a indentured servitude, or this is a I'm a slave, my children will be slaves, their children will be slaves sort of thing?
There's a little bit of both. Slavery that exists today is not the kind that we envisioned or that we think about in America back in the day when slaves were being traded. So you just go to like a market and you say, I'll buy you for $1,000.
Uh-huh.
That kind of thing, and being able to trade slaves, that kind of stuff. That is not as big. That's called chattel slavery. But what you will see is bonded labor, or people have like debt slaves.
Okay.
So what happens is you're a parent and you want to buy something and you get into debt, and eventually the person who owes you debt, you say basically, well, why don't you just take my children and they'll work for you for 10 years and then that will pay off the debt. So what a lot of times parents will give their children to richer people who they owe money to or they want to earn money, and that way they'll get, and sometimes the slave owner will give money to the poor parents. So it's a way for the parents to make some money and to buy food and that kind of stuff. Just no parent likes to give away their child just like that, but if it means getting some food, that's what they'll do. And people might say, but that's crazy. But think of it, if you're a parent, you're not going to send your child to school anyway. So the child's not going to go
Right.
to school and you're not going to be able to feed your child adequately anyway. You may not be able to give them anything. If you give them away to a richer person, that person's going to be able to feed them better. They're not going to send them to school, but at least they'll have a home that has water, electricity, and be able to live okay. Versus being out in the Sahara where you have no water, no electricity, or you have to go get water in a well, and it's inconvenient, and no school, and you're poor and you have a terrible nutrition. So I'm just trying to understand the parents' perspective, because for me it sounded crazy. And eventually, though, spending enough time with meeting slaves and understanding the whole logic behind it, I'm not trying to condone it. I'm just trying to understand why it still exists today and
Mhm.
what is the motivations and that kind of stuff. But
Well, and some of that actually exists still in the U.S. as well, indentured servitude, even though slavery is illegal. Whether it should or not is an entirely different question. But people who are earning the pay for coming to the U.S., which happened way back in the colonies as well. You would be a servant for 7 years, for instance, to repay your trip to the U.S. Was one of the ways that even in the North things got founded.
yeah, the big difference, I guess, is that you and I were from America and you'll never run into a slave. I mean, it's very hard to. You have to kind of really go looking for it. Whereas here in West Africa, I run into them often. I mean, anywhere, like I said, anywhere between 5% to 25% of the population, depending on the country in West Africa, are slaves. And so inevitably, if you are mingling with people and families and staying with families, you're going to find some slaves.
Interesting. In what may make an awkward transition, what was the best day you had in Western Sahara?
I would say hanging out with those camel guys, the guys who had all those camels. It's just an unexpected, it's one of those wonderful things where you just throw yourself out there when you're traveling. You just cross your fingers and hope for the best. And I hit jackpot there. Really had a great time with them. They would make tea out in the middle of nowhere. And that's the funny thing. It's kind of warm sometimes and they're making hot tea here and there. with a lot of sugar in it. And that's the difference between Moroccan tea, which is absolutely delicious. They put mint and sugar in it.
Hmm.
In the Western Sahara, the tea changes. You won't find that kind of minty tea. You'll find much more, I guess, the more like English tea, if you want to think of it, or Indian tea or that kind of stuff. It's not less minty and smaller portions. So I don't know if that has to do with the fact that they're much more in where water is more precious. But where in Morocco, you'll get a nice tall glass of tea. In the Western Sahara, they'll give you this little shot glass of tea. But the preparation is still kind of a nice, meticulous ceremony, big ritual where they're kind of mixing up the tea. It's fascinating to watch it being made. And they'll load it up with sugar, and it's a great shot of caffeine.
And I'm assuming that you didn't decide to change your career to be a camel herder after that experience, though.
No, but it definitely made me appreciate and love the Sahara. Like I say, it's deserts. I mean, I love mountains, I love deserts, but it's fascinating to be in that culture and then see how people live day to day in these places that are quote unquote inhospitable. And yet you find such hospitality in these inhospitable places. It's fascinating.
Excellent. Before we get to my last three questions, what else should we know before we head to the Western Sahara?
That it's safe. I mean, I can't emphasize that
Besides
enough.
the landmines, it's entirely safe.
Yeah. Well, again, you're only going to go into the landmine issue if you go off road.
Right.
And you should only go off road unless you have somebody who's knowledgeable about the road. So that solves that problem. But I would say the number one thing is that it's safe. And the number two thing is make sure that you don't just stay on the coastline. Try to get into the interior, anywhere in the interior, just for variety. Number three, realize that it does get cold out there.
Right.
At nighttime, it can get chilly. So don't go out there just with shorts. And do be respectful. I mean, this is an Arabic culture, and you do want to cover yourself up, men and women, not to, even though it can be quite hot, don't go out there with your shorty shorts on. It might offend a few people, especially if you're a woman.
One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Western Sahara.
Only in Western Sahara will you be able to be out in the middle of nowhere and have a nice warm camel drink. Camel milk. That was quite unusual.
And you really know you're in the Western Sahara when what?
When you hit a landmine.
I'm hoping I would know sometime before that, but I believe that is a unique answer on the show. In 400 and some episodes, we've never had that as an answer.
No, you know you're in the Western Sahara when you're driving along and all of a sudden you see kind of this low wall, a sand / earth wall, and you realize that's ain't the Great. We're not in China, so that's not the Great Wall of China. It can only be one thing. It's got to be the Moroccan Wall, and that's when you know for sure you are in the Western Sahara, without a doubt.
Excellent. And if you had to summarize Western Sahara in 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Desert, sea, empty.
Excellent.
Can I use the Spanish word? Nada. Nada. A whole lot of nada.
A whole lot of nada. So, as we have alluded to, people can also see what you're doing because you are working on a TV show. Tell us a little more about that.
On May 25th, which is Africa Day, it's the official Africa Day in the world, I will be doing a Kickstarter campaign that will be looking to raise money to do a pilot episode for a TV series called The Unseen Africa. So what I've been doing for over a year now that I've been in Africa is filming everywhere I go. And I've been basically trying to capture parts of Africa that we're just not used to seeing on television, because basically the image that we always see on television is either good stuff like primitive tribes dancing around, or the pyramids, or wildlife, or you have negative images like AIDS, pestilence, crime, war, and disease. So I'm trying to get beyond those two stereotypical images of Africa and explore the parts of Africa that we're just not used to seeing, like the Western Sahara, for example. And when I go to places that are well known, like Morocco, try to go parts of Morocco that are just not often seen. And so that's the focus of the television show. And I'm hoping that people will go to theunseenafrica.com or go to africa54.com and then check out the Kickstarter campaign. Look at the 3-minute trailer video. You'll see a lot of the images that I just talked about, because that episode will be based, the pilot episode I'm hoping to raise $15,000 for, is going to be based on Morocco, and that will include Western Sahara footage. So a lot of things that we just talked about the show, you'll be able to see on the trailer, and I hope you can put the trailer also on your website as well, Chris.
Sure, absolutely. We'll put the trailer, and then we'll also link off to Francis's website. So if you don't remember his website, you certainly, hopefully, at this point, will remember Amateur Traveler. So we'll put it all there. Well, Francis, thanks so much for coming back on the show. I suspect we'll want to have you on again here as this grand adventure continues.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'd love to be back one day.
And I'm glad that we had electricity enough for the whole recording here. And we look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you again.
In news of the community, there are more and more transcripts available for Amateur Traveler episodes, so you might want to check that out on the website, amateurtraveler.com. And with that, we'll end this episode of the Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com or send me an email to host@amateurtraveler.com. You can also join the Facebook community or follow me on Twitter at Chris2X. And as always, thanks so much for listening.